Regulators continue to buzz this week over the role Goldman played in helping mask Greece's ballooning debt with complex derivatives. It's not the first time swaps used by Goldman have come under the microscope. For a closer look at how companies are using the instruments for legitimate and sometimes illegitimate ends, we're joined by the editor-in-chief of Westlaw Business Currents, a unit of Thomson Reuters, and that is Ellie Raisen. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
So, in theory, there's nothing wrong with swaps, whether they are cross-currency swaps, total return swaps. So why are we talking about it? Why are the red flags here?
So to go back to Business School 101, swaps are completely legitimate and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. But what we're talking about here are not your run-of-the-mill swaps. This is a special kind of bespoke swap, a customized contract that's structured in a way very different from what we all learned in business school. And essentially what these swaps do is two things. They first of all provide a loan-like structure. They're a funding mechanism without calling it a loan. They also, however, take assets that some countries or companies may not want to have within the gaze of their regulator and move them off the books. And if that sounds familiar from other off-balance sheet transactions, that's exactly what this does as well. So
with other off-balance sheet transactions, we've had some people get in trouble, so we've had some regulators step in. What are regulators doing right now, and what do you see happening?
So to begin with, there's two groups of swaps that we're talking about here. The Greek situation is somewhat unique, and it sort of relates to the history of the European Union. What Greece did in 2001 is no longer legal to be done under European Union rules. They would have to have come clean a long time ago. But back then, they didn't have to. In the case of companies, for example, CIT Group entered into a swap with Goldman, which I think is one of those that you were getting at. In the case of companies, those kind of swaps, which are called total return swaps, are similarly structured, funding up front, some move of assets outside of the regulator's gaze. They are required, because of what happened in the aftermath of Enron, they are now required by the SEC to come clean about this. And CIT came absolutely clean. It was disclosed back when it entered into this transaction with Goldman in the summer of 2008.
So what's the next step for regulators? Do you think that because of the increased scrutiny now that they'll be doing something else?
So one of the things that our team at Westlaw Business keeps an eye on is where lawyers are ahead of regulators. And this is a case in point. We're absolutely seeing that smart lawyers, some of whom may be on Goldman's legal staff and many of whom may be on Goldman's banking staff, came up with these bespoke structures to suit the laws at the time and meet the company's funding needs. And we think now, yes, regulators absolutely have caught on to this. But Goldman and others are not sitting still. They're absolutely continuing to innovate as the laws continue to change. So too we expect these contracts to begin to change. But the one thing that we're all learning from this is that we don't all know what's going on behind the curtain, because until the regulators force disclosure, many counterparties, be they companies or sovereigns, don't necessarily come clean until somebody tells them they must.
So what are investors to do faced with the knowledge that they might not come clean unless they're forced to?
Correct. So in an environment like the States where investors are all used to disclosures and expect those disclosures to be thorough, here what we have to do is take a little bit more jaded eye at the kind of things that we're looking at. And that might be in the form of what the textual disclosures say. It certainly would be in the financial statements of companies. And so, for example, if you might see asset numbers change without really any explanation or any plausible explanation, one of the things that you might consider if the company is troubled enough to want to get into one of these kind of swaps is that there may be some kind of swap activity going on behind the scenes that lets them move assets off their books. But I would emphasize that in many cases, total return swaps, first of all, are completely legitimate. They are disclosed. But some of these other things, a red flag might be a sudden change in a number that you can't readily explain. And that might be, if the company is troubled enough to want to get into one of these very expensive swap structures, that might be what's driving it.
All right, Ellie Raisen, a complicated issue indeed, but one we're probably going to be seeing a lot more of. Ellie Raisen is the editor-in-chief of Westlaw Business Currents. To read Westlaw's article on this topic, you can click on the Related Documents tab below. This is Reuters.